July 14th, 1944, somewhere in Normandy, then somewhere else entirely. The whiteness came first, not the blinding flash of artillery, not the yellow-gray of smoke and dust that had filled his last waking moments, but a clean, impossible white that seemed to glow with its own light. Feldwebel Klaus Richter opened his eyes and saw heaven, or what he imagined heaven might look like if God favored American military surplus. The ceiling was perfect, not a crack, not a water stain, not a single fragment of plaster dangling by a thread, as in every French barn, Belgian farmhouse, and German field station he'd occupied in the past 4 years. Just white, pristine, impossible. His leg throbbed, a deep, almost musical ache that sang up through his hip and settled somewhere behind his eyes. But it was there. He could feel it. Not the hot, wet absence he'd felt 3 days ago. Was it 3 days? When the shell fragment had torn through his thigh, and he'd looked down to see meat and bone where a leg should be. This was pain with a future tense. Pain that promised tomorrow. Guten Morgen, Sergeant. The voice was wrong. Female, young, American-accented German filtered through what sounded like a Kansas prairie, each consonant softened, each vowel stretched like taffy. Klaus turned his head, slowly, because the world tilted when he moved too fast, and saw her. She was perhaps 22, with auburn hair pinned beneath a white cap marked with a red cross. Her uniform was crisp, impossibly clean, and she smiled at him the way his sister used to smile when he'd wake from childhood nightmares. Without fear, without hatred, as if he were simply a person who'd been asleep and was now awake. "Wo bin ich?" he whispered, his throat raw. "An American field hospital," she replied, her German improving with each word, as if she were remembering lessons from a classroom somewhere in the vast American interior. "You're safe now. The war—" She paused, searching for the word, then settled on English. "Is over for you. The war is over for you." 5 words that should have felt like defeat, but instead landed soft as snow. Klaus tried to process this, but his mind kept catching on that ceiling, on the fact that he could see it at all, on the fact that beneath the crisp white sheets, sheets that smelled of soap, real soap, not the carbolic harshness of German military issue, his leg was still attached to his body. "Mein Bein," he said. "My leg." "Saved," she said simply. "Dr. Morrison operated yesterday. Cleaned the wound, set the bone, closed it up proper. You'll walk again." Yesterday? He'd been operated on yesterday. Not next week, not after the officers and the priority cases, not after the supplies arrived, or the surgeon sobered up, or the morphine was redistributed from wherever it had been stolen to. Yesterday. Immediately. As if his life, the life of a German sergeant major, an enemy, a prisoner, mattered enough to act without hesitation. Klaus closed his eyes, but the whiteness remained, burned into his retinas like the afterimage of an explosion. Except this explosion was silent, internal, and far more devastating than anything he'd experienced in 4 years of war. It was the explosion of a belief system encountering contradictory evidence. They had told him the Americans were soft, decadent, a nation of mongrels and Jews and gangsters who would collapse under the first serious pressure, whose soldiers would throw down their weapons and run, whose vaunted industrial capacity was a paper tiger inflated by propaganda. The propaganda had not mentioned the ceiling. 6 days earlier, Klaus Richter had been a different person, or perhaps the same person who simply didn't know what he didn't know, which amounts to the same thing. The hedgerows of Normandy in early July were killing zones, each one a miniature fortress that turned every field into a siege, every advance into a bloodletting. Klaus's unit, what remained of the 352nd Infantry Division, had been falling back for 3 weeks, a slow hemorrhage of men and material that no amount of officers' speeches or threats could stanch. They'd dug in, near St. Lo, in a position that offered excellent sight lines and absolutely no chance of holding. Klaus had known it the moment he'd surveyed the ground. He'd known it in the way you know things after 4 years of war, in your bones, in the sick weight in your stomach, in the way the newer conscripts looked at him for reassurance he couldn't give. "We'll hold until relieved," said Lieutenant Werner, a 23-year-old from Munich who still believed what he read in the dispatches from Berlin. "The Führer has promised reinforcements." Klaus had nodded because you nodded at lieutenants and begun preparing for the reality the lieutenant hadn't yet learned. There would be no reinforcements. There was no cavalry coming over the hill. There was only the slow, grinding arithmetic of American artillery, and the even slower realization that the war they'd been told was righteous and necessary and winnable, had been lost before it began. The Americans came on July 8, 1944, at 0400 hours with an artillery barrage that made the earth itself seem to liquefy. Klaus had experienced bombardments before. The Russians were artists of artillery, true masters of the form, but this was different. This wasn't designed to kill, though it killed plenty. It was designed to overwhelm, to make resistance not just futile, but unthinkable. Shells fell with metronomic precision, walking across their positions in neat rows, as if some vast invisible hand were planting seeds of destruction in perfectly measured intervals. Klaus huddled in his foxhole and tried to count the seconds between impacts, but gave up when he realized there were no seconds between impacts. The barrage was continuous, a rolling thunder that erased thought. When it stopped, as suddenly as it had started, Klaus's ears rang so loudly he couldn't hear Gefreiter Schmidt screaming beside him, couldn't hear the approach of the American infantry, couldn't hear his own voice as he shouted orders to men who might already be dead. They came through the smoke, like figures from a nightmare, but a nightmare rendered in crisp, well-fed reality. American infantry advancing with the casual confidence of men who knew they had endless supplies, endless support, endless everything waiting behind them. Klaus fired his Mauser, 3 shots, 4, 5, and saw 1 man go down, maybe 2. It didn't matter. For every American who fell, 3 more appeared. Lieutenant Werner stood up, inexplicably, perhaps to rally the men, or perhaps because something in his young mind had finally snapped under the weight of recognizing a doomed cause. He managed 2 words, "Für Deutschland," before the machine gun cut him in half. Klaus didn't remember making the decision to retreat. He remembered running, the hedgerow catching at his uniform, Schmidt beside him breathing in ragged gasps, the sound of American voices behind them, not shouting, not screaming, just calling to each other with the calm efficiency of men doing a job they'd been trained to do. The shell caught him as he vaulted a stone wall. He didn't hear it coming. His ears were still ringing from the bombardment. But he felt it arrive, a massive fist of pressure and heat that picked him up and threw him 15 feet through the air. He landed in a drainage ditch, and the first thing he noticed, even before the pain arrived, was the wrongness of his right leg. It was bent at an angle. Legs don't bend. Bone protruded through the gray-green wool of his uniform trousers, white and obscene. The pain came then, a wave so intense it whited out his vision, and Klaus heard himself scream, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere outside his body, as if he were listening to a stranger's agony. Schmidt found him there, half drowned in muddy water that was rapidly turning red. Klaus tried to tell him to run, to save himself, but couldn't form words. The world narrowed to a tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. He was dying. He knew he was dying. This was how it ended, not gloriously, not meaningfully, but bleeding out in a French ditch while his country collapsed around him. Then the Americans arrived. Klaus expected a bullet. It's what he would have done, what any rational soldier would do. You don't waste medical supplies on the enemy when your own men are bleeding. You grant mercy and move on. But the American who knelt beside him, a medic with a red cross on his helmet and a face so young he might have been in high school, didn't reach for his sidearm. He reached for his medical kit. "Holy hell," the medic said in English, and Klaus understood none of the words, but all of the meaning. The medic shouted something, and 2 more Americans appeared with a stretcher. They worked with shocking efficiency. Tourniquet on his thigh, morphine in his arm, Klaus's body lifted with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "You're gonna make it, Fritz," the medic said, and though Klaus didn't speak English, he understood that too. The tone said, "I will not let you die." The tone said, "Your life has value, even here, even now." Klaus's last conscious thought before the morphine took him was a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Why are they saving me? The American Field Hospital occupied what had recently been a French manor house, one of those sprawling country estates that had somehow survived 4 years of occupation and combat through a combination of luck and advantageous positioning. Klaus learned this later, when he could think again, when the morphine haze cleared enough for him to take inventory of his new reality. He woke fully on his second day. The first day didn't count, being mostly fragments of consciousness interrupted by surgery, medication, and the strange dreams that come when your body is trying to process trauma it doesn't have the resources to process. On the second day, he woke to that white ceiling again, and this time he had the presence of mind to look around. The ward held perhaps 40 beds, arranged in neat rows that would have pleased any German quartermaster. Each bed was occupied, some by Americans, some by Germans, one by what appeared to be a French civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Americans didn't separate the enemy wounded from their own. They were simply arranged by injury severity, a triage based on medical need rather than national allegiance. In the bed to Klaus's right lay an American private. Thompson, his chart said, with both legs in traction. To his left, another German, an Oberfeldwebel named Friedrich Baumann, who'd taken shrapnel to his abdomen and had the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd seen his own intestines. "They operated on both of us at the same time," Baumann whispered when he saw Klaus was awake. His voice had the wondering quality of someone recounting a miracle. Side by side, the same surgeon, the same nurses. They didn't... He paused, searching for words. They didn't choose. They just worked. Klaus tried to process this. In German military medicine, triage was a ruthless calculation. Officers before enlisted men, able-bodied before wounded, German before foreign. It had to be that way, they'd been told. Resources were limited. Choices had to be made. Sentiment was a luxury a nation at war couldn't afford. But here, in this converted French manor house, with American medical staff moving between beds with quiet efficiency, the rules were different. No, not different. Absent entirely. The only hierarchy was urgency. The only calculus was need. A doctor approached, tall, perhaps 50, with graying hair and glasses that caught the light from the tall windows. His uniform bore the insignia of a major, and his name tag read, Morrison. "Ah, you're awake," he said in English, then switched to passable German. "How's the pain?" Klaus considered lying, some vestige of military pride suggesting he should minimize his discomfort, but decided truth was simpler. "Bad," he said, "but bearable." Morrison nodded and consulted Klaus's chart, a thick sheaf of papers covered in neat handwriting that suggested someone had taken great care in documenting every detail of his condition. The femur was fractured in 3 places, and you had significant soft tissue damage, the doctor said, his tone clinical but not cold. "We were able to save the leg, but it was close. Another hour, maybe 2, and you would have lost it." Another hour. Klaus thought about the American medics who'd stabilized him in that ditch, about the ambulance that had brought him here through roads still under intermittent artillery fire, about this doctor who'd operated on him, an enemy combatant, with the same care he'd presumably given to Thompson in the next bed. "Why?" Klaus asked. The question came out raw, almost childlike. Morrison looked at him over his glasses. "Why what? Why save me? I'm your enemy." The doctor was quiet for a moment, and Klaus thought he saw something complicated move across his face. Not pity, not condescension, but a kind of weary wisdom. "You're a patient," Morrison said finally. "That's all that matters in this room. The war stays outside." He moved on to check on Baumann, leaving Klaus to stare at the ceiling and grapple with the cognitive dissonance threatening to crack his understanding of the world. The Americans were supposed to be weak, sentimental. a nation of shopkeepers and farm boys playing at war. They were supposed to fold under pressure, to lack the discipline and ruthlessness that the German military had spent decades cultivating. But nothing about this hospital suggested weakness. The efficiency was Prussian in its precision. The equipment was better than anything Klaus had seen in 4 years of German military service. Modern, plentiful, apparently limitless. The staff moved with the confidence of people who knew they had everything they needed to do their jobs properly. And the care itself, the actual medical treatment, was given without the constant mental calculus of scarcity that had defined every aspect of Klaus's military experience. These Americans acted as if they believed there would always be enough. Enough morphine, enough bandages, enough time, enough humanity. Over the following days, as Klaus's body slowly began the long work of healing, he watched and learned. He watched American nurses change bandages with a gentleness that German medical staff had abandoned somewhere around 1942, when tenderness became a luxury they couldn't afford. He watched American doctors spend 30 minutes with a patient. 30 minutes. When German surgeons had been taught to keep consultations under 5. He watched them save the life of Friedrich Baumann, whose abdominal wounds should have killed him. He watched them amputate the gangrenous foot of an American corporal with the same careful attention they'd given to preserving Klaus's leg. He watched them work 16-hour shifts and still find the energy to smile, to joke, to treat their patients as if each one mattered personally. On his 5th day in the hospital, Klaus experienced his most profound shock. Not physical, but philosophical. A dental officer, Captain Richard Wade, according to his name tag, made rounds through the ward, checking on patients' oral health with the systematic thoroughness of a man who'd been trained to believe that even teeth mattered, even in war, even for prisoners. Wade stopped at Klaus's bed, consulted his chart, and said in careful German, "Says here you've been complaining of tooth pain. May I take a look?" Klaus almost laughed. Tooth pain. He'd had a chronic abscess in his lower left molar for 8 months. 8 months. And had simply learned to live with it. In the German army, dental care was something you received when you were in garrison, if supplies were available, if there was time, if you were important enough. For a Feldwebel on the front lines, tooth pain was just another discomfort to be ignored, like cold or hunger or fear. "It's nothing," Klaus said automatically. "Not worth your time." Wade smiled, a warm, professional smile that reminded Klaus of the family dentist he'd visited as a child in Hamburg before the war, before everything changed. That's exactly what my American patients say, and it's exactly as untrue when they say it. Open up. The examination took perhaps 3 minutes. Wade probed gently, made a thoughtful sound, and nodded. "Abscessed molar. That must hurt like hell. We'll get you fixed up tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning. Not next week. Not when they return to a proper facility. Not never. Tomorrow morning, as if the dental health of a German prisoner of war was worth the same attention as an American soldier's. The procedure took place in a converted library, shelves still lined with French novels and philosophical texts, watched over by a dentist's chair that looked brand new, as if it had been shipped directly from some American factory still operating at full capacity. Wade worked with a chattiness that Klaus found both bizarre and oddly comforting, explaining what he was doing, even though Klaus understood perhaps 1 word in 5. "Novocaine first. You'll feel a pinch. There we go. Give it a minute to work. You know, I'm from Ohio, small town called Springfield. My practice there is probably covered in dust right now. My wife's running it. She's better with the books than I ever was. You married, Sergeant." Klaus grunted something non-committal, his mouth full of instruments and German inhibitions about discussing personal matters with the enemy. "I'll take that as a not right now," Wade said cheerfully. "Well, plenty of time for that after the war. Okay, you're good and numb. Let's get that bad boy out of there." The extraction was painless, or rather the pain that should have been there was replaced by pressure and the disconcerting sound of bone giving way to metal. Wade worked with steady confidence, the confidence of a man who'd pulled 1,000 teeth and would pull 1,000 more, who saw no meaningful difference between the mouth of an American farm boy and a German sergeant major. "All done," Wade said, displaying the extracted molar with the pride of a fisherman showing off his catch. "That was a nasty one. You'd have been in real trouble if that infection had spread. You're lucky you're here." Lucky. Klaus held the gauze Wade had packed into the socket and contemplated that word. Lucky to have been hit by shrapnel. Lucky to have been captured. Lucky to have been brought to this impossible hospital where American dentists treated enemy prisoners as if their comfort mattered. The propaganda had been very clear. Americans were mongrels, cowards, profiteers who would abandon their principles the moment maintaining them became inconvenient. But Wade hadn't seen a mongrel in Klaus's mouth. He'd seen a patient with an abscess, and he'd fixed it with the same care he'd presumably given to every other patient in his Ohio practice, and he'd done it without hesitation, without resentment, without any apparent recognition that there was anything remarkable about the transaction. Back in the ward, Klaus lay in his bed and pressed his tongue gently against the empty socket, testing the absence where constant pain had been. The relief was immense, almost euphoric, not just physical, though the physical relief was considerable, but psychological. Someone had cared enough about his suffering to end it. An enemy had seen his pain and chosen to alleviate it, not because it served any military purpose, not because it advanced any strategic goal, but simply because alleviating suffering was what dentists did, and Klaus was someone suffering, and therefore worthy of care. It was this, more than the surgery that saved his leg, more than the clean sheets or the abundant food or the morphine freely given, that began to crack the foundation of everything Klaus had believed about the war, about the Americans, about the world. In late July 1944, Klaus Richter was transferred to a prisoner of war camp in the American interior, somewhere in Tennessee, he learned later, though at the time it might as well have been on the moon. The journey took 3 weeks, moving from temporary holding facilities to trains to trucks to buses, a logistical chain so smooth and efficient it made the German Army's vaunted organizational skills look like amateur hour. The camp itself was a revelation. Officially designated Camp Forest, it sprawled across several hundred acres of Tennessee farmland. A small city of barracks, workshops, administrative buildings, and facilities that suggested the Americans had thought very carefully about what it meant to hold 10,000 men for an indefinite period. The other prisoners, men from every branch of the German military, from every region of what had been the Third Reich, talked constantly. It was all they could do, really, confined as they were behind wire, but free from the immediate danger of combat. They talked about the food. "They feed us 2,500 calories a day," said Josef Kramer, a former corporal from Bremen, who'd been captured in North Africa and had been in American custody for over a year. More than German soldiers are getting at the front. More than civilians are getting at home. Klaus didn't believe him at first. It sounded like a fantasy, the kind of wishful thinking desperate men engage in. But the evidence arrived 3 times daily, served on metal trays in portions that would have been generous in peacetime Germany, let alone wartime. Bread, real wheat bread, not the sawdust-laced Kriegsbrot they'd been eating since 1942. Meat, actual meat, in quantities that seemed criminally wasteful. Vegetables, fresh vegetables, that hadn't been wilted or half-rotten or stretched with filler. "They're fattening us up for something," muttered Ernst Hoffmann, a suspicious Bavarian who saw conspiracy in everything. "No one feeds prisoners like this without a reason." But the weeks passed, and no sinister purpose revealed itself. The food kept coming. The Americans, it seemed, fed their prisoners well for the simple reason that they believed prisoners should be fed well. The Geneva Convention said so, and the Americans, improbably, almost comically, followed the Geneva Convention as if it were scripture, rather than the suggestion it had become in Europe. The work came next. Prisoners were assigned to labor details, farm work mostly, since Tennessee in summer needed hands to bring in tobacco and cotton and all the crops that kept the war machine fed. The Americans paid them for this work, actually paid them in script that could be used in the camp canteen, as if the labor of enemy prisoners had monetary value, as if the sweat of a German sergeant major was worth 80 cents per day. Klaus worked the tobacco fields and tried to reconcile this new reality with the old. In Germany, forced labor was forced. Concentration camp inmates, Soviet prisoners, conquered peoples working until they died because their lives held no value beyond what could be extracted from their bodies. But here in Tennessee, Americans believed that even enemy prisoners deserved compensation for their time, deserved breaks from the sun, deserved water freely given rather than earned through subservience. The camp had a library, an actual library, with books in German, periodicals, newspapers. It had a theater where prisoners could stage productions. It had sports leagues, educational classes, workshops where men could learn carpentry or mechanics or English. It had, in other words, everything necessary for men to remain human during their confinement, rather than merely survive it. But nothing prepared Klaus for the medical clinic. He went initially because his legs still bothered him. Not badly, but enough that walking long hours in the tobacco fields left him limping by evening. He expected a cursory examination, perhaps some aspirin, maybe a recommendation to work through the pain. Instead, he got Dr. Sarah Brennan. She was perhaps 35, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of eyes that suggested she'd seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes, but had somehow retained the belief that suffering could be meaningfully addressed. Her German was excellent. She'd studied in Munich before the war, she explained, back when Germany meant Brahms and Goethe, rather than jackboots and gas chambers. "Let's see what we're working with," she said, gesturing for Klaus to sit. Her examination was thorough, professional, and revealed that the leg had healed slightly crooked, not enough to cause real disability, but enough that the mechanics were wrong, that certain muscles were compensating for others, that pain was inevitable if he continued pushing it. "We can fix this," Brennan said. "Physical therapy mostly. Exercises to strengthen the right muscles, stretches to lengthen the tight ones. It'll take a few months, but you'll be much better off." A few months. She was talking about a few months of dedicated medical care for a German prisoner of war, as if he might be here for a few months, as if investing time and resources into his long-term health made any kind of sense. "The war will be over before then," Klaus said, not sure if he was asking a question or making a statement. Brennan looked at him with an expression that managed to be both compassionate and brutally honest. "Yes," she said, "it will be. And you'll still have that leg after it ends. Better to fix it now than let you suffer unnecessarily." The physical therapy sessions became Klaus's anchor. 3 times weekly he reported to the clinic where Brennan or one of her staff, all Americans, all professionals, all treating him with the same clinical courtesy they'd give anyone, put him through exercises designed to retrain his body's understanding of how a leg should work. It was during one of these sessions, while Klaus was grimacing through a particularly difficult stretch, that Brennan asked, "What will you do after the war?" The question caught him off guard. After the war. There would be an after, apparently. A future beyond barbed wire and guard towers, beyond defeat and occupation, beyond everything he'd known for 4 years. "Return to Germany," he said automatically, "because that's what you said. That's what loyalty demanded." "To what?" Brennan asked, not unkindly. "Klaus, may I call you Klaus? Germany is rubble. The cities are being bombed into dust. The government is collapsed or collapsing. The ideology that sent you to war is revealed as the horror it always was. What exactly are you returning to?" Klaus had no answer. Or rather, he had too many answers, all of them terrible. He would return to Hamburg, which no longer existed as anything but a memory and a crater. He would return to a family that might be dead, might be scattered, might want nothing to do with a soldier who'd fought for a regime they'd come to hate. He would return to a nation that would spend generations trying to understand how it had descended into madness. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but it's my home." "Is it?" Brennan asked. "Or is it just where you're from? There's a difference." Over the following months, and they were months, plural because the war ground on with the inexorable slowness of inevitability, Klaus found himself thinking about Brennan's question, about home, about belonging, about what it meant to be German when Germany had become a word synonymous with atrocity. The other prisoners talked constantly about after. Some clung to fantasy. Hitler's secret weapons, the miracle that would turn the tide, the reinforcements that would push back the Allies. But most, by autumn of 1944, had moved past denial into a kind of quiet reckoning. They were young men who'd been told they were fighting for civilization, and they were slowly, painfully recognizing that they'd been fighting for its opposite. In October, Klaus wrote to the camp authorities requesting information about immigration. It felt like betrayal of his comrades, of his country, of everything he'd been raised to believe, about duty and loyalty. But it also felt like survival, like choosing life over the slow death of returning to a nation that no longer existed except as a geographical expression. The American officer who handled such matters, Captain James Morton, a career bureaucrat who'd somehow ended up administering the futures of enemy prisoners, was neither surprised nor judgmental. "You're not the first," Morton said in his office, surrounded by files representing thousands of German lives in limbo. "Won't be the last. The United States accepts a certain number of former enemy combatants under specific circumstances. You'd need to demonstrate integration potential, useful skills, and," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "genuine repudiation of Nazi ideology." "I fought for Germany," Klaus said carefully. "Not for Nazis." Morton's expression suggested he'd heard this before and wasn't entirely convinced. "Many Germans make that distinction. The question is whether it's a meaningful one. Did you commit war crimes?" "No." "Were you a party member?" "No." "Did you participate in or witness actions against civilians, Jews, political prisoners?" "I was frontline infantry. We fought other soldiers." Morton made notes. "That simplifies things. You have education." "Secondary school. Apprenticed as an electrician before conscription." "Skilled trade. That helps." "And your conduct here has been exemplary. The camp records show you as a model prisoner. That helps too." Morton leaned back. "I can't make promises, but I can file the paperwork. It'll take time. Probably won't be resolved until well after the war ends. But if you're serious about staying, about becoming American—" He let the sentence hang. "I'm serious," Klaus said, and realized he meant it. The news arrived in fragmentary pieces, each one a hammer blow to whatever remained of the old world. In December 1944, the Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's last gamble, initially successful before collapsing into catastrophic failure. In January 1945, the Soviet advance into Germany from the east, bringing stories of vengeance and destruction. In April, American and Soviet forces meeting at the Elbe, Germany cut in half like a patient on an operating table. And finally, in May 1945, surrender. Klaus heard the news in the camp's recreation hall, where a group of prisoners had gathered around a radio, listening to the BBC's German service. The announcer's voice was calm, almost gentle, as he described the end of the Third Reich. Admiral Dönitz had signed the instrument of surrender. The German military would lay down its arms. The war in Europe was over. Some prisoners wept. Some sat in stunned silence. A few, the true believers, the ones who'd never stopped believing, raged and ranted until the guards led them away. Klaus felt nothing, or rather felt too many things to separate into distinct emotions. Relief, horror, shame, confusion. And beneath it all, a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What now? The answer came slowly over the following months and years. The camp remained operational. There were still thousands of German prisoners in American custody, and repatriation was a logistical nightmare, complicated by the fact that Germany itself no longer existed as a functional nation. Some prisoners were sent back to the Soviet zone, often against their will, knowing they were trading American imprisonment for something far worse. Others waited, hoped, applied for immigration to the United States, to Canada, to anywhere that wasn't the ruins they'd helped create. Klaus's application moved through the bureaucracy with the characteristic slowness of large institutions, but it moved, in his favor. His clean record, his skilled trade, the testimonials from Dr. Brennan and others who'd observed his behavior and found it satisfactory. Against him, the simple fact of what he'd been, what he'd worn, which side he'd fought for. In November 1947, 3.5 years after waking up under that white ceiling, Klaus Richter received permission to remain in the United States as a permanent resident, with a path to citizenship after 5 years. The day he walked out of Camp Forest as a free man, not a prisoner, not a soldier, just a person, Klaus carried everything he owned in a single duffel bag. The bag contained 3 changes of clothes, a Bible his mother had given him before the war, a photograph of his family that might be the only proof they'd ever existed, and a letter of reference from Dr. Sarah Brennan, describing him as a man who chose to become better than his circumstances suggested. He found work in Nashville, not far from the camp, at an electrical company that asked few questions about his past and cared mainly that he could wire a house without burning it down. The work was simple, honest, and paid enough to rent a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew he'd been a German sergeant major, where his accent marked him as foreign but not necessarily enemy. The dreams came often in those first years, dreams of combat, of dying in that French ditch, of waking up to find the white ceiling had been a hallucination and he was actually in some Soviet camp or shallow grave. But gradually, the dreams faded, or rather were replaced by others. Dreams of futures, possibilities, the strange luxury of planning for tomorrow. In 1952, Klaus became an American citizen. The ceremony took place in a courthouse in Nashville, surrounded by dozens of other immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, Chinese, all taking the same oath, all choosing to become what the American experiment promised they could be. When the judge said, "I now pronounce you citizens of the United States," Klaus felt something shift inside him, some final severing of the cord that had connected him to who he'd been. He never returned to Germany. His family, those who'd survived, wrote occasionally stilted letters full of careful elisions about what they'd experienced, what they'd known, what they'd done or failed to do. Klaus wrote back, equally careful, equally elided. They were connected by blood and history, but separated by choice, by the fundamental difference between those who'd stayed and those who'd left, those who'd returned and those who'd refused to. In 1954, Klaus married an American woman named Margaret who worked as a nurse and who listened to his story without judgment, who understood that people could be more than their worst moments, who believed in the possibility of redemption. They had children, 2 daughters who grew up knowing their father had fought in the war, but never quite understanding which side he'd been on, never quite grasping the miraculous improbability of his survival and transformation. In 1989, Klaus Richter, now 70 years old, retired grandfather of 5, watched on television as the Berlin Wall fell. Young Germans danced on the concrete barrier that had divided their nation for nearly half a century, chipping away at it with hammers and picks and bare hands, tearing down the physical manifestation of the Cold War that had been a direct consequence of the hot war Klaus had fought in. He watched and remembered the propaganda that had promised German greatness, remembered the lies that had sent millions to their deaths, remembered the moment he'd woken up under a white ceiling in an American field hospital and had his first glimpse of a truth the propaganda had never mentioned, that strength isn't measured by the capacity for destruction, but by the capacity for mercy. Margaret found him in the living room, tears streaming down his weathered face, and sat beside him without speaking. After 45 years of marriage, she knew when words were necessary and when silence was enough. "I was thinking about Dr. Morrison," Klaus said finally, his English still carrying traces of Hamburg despite decades of practice. "And that nurse whose name I never learned, and Captain Wade, who fixed my tooth as if it mattered, as if I mattered." Margaret took his hand, the same hand that had once held a rifle, that had fired at American soldiers, that had been raised in salutes to a regime that represented everything evil. That hand was now spotted with age, arthritic, gentle. It was a hand that had wired 10,000 American homes, that had held his daughters when they were born. that had built a life from the ashes of the life he'd destroyed. They saved me, Klaus continued. Not just my life. Anyone can save a life. They saved my humanity. They treated me as if I deserved to be treated well, even when I'd done nothing to deserve it, even when my country had done everything to forfeit any right to kindness. On the television, young Germans continued their celebration, tearing down the wall piece by piece, reuniting families separated by history and ideology and the consequences of choices made long ago. Klaus wondered if any of them understood, truly understood, the miracle of their moment, the improbability of peace, the fragile gift of a second chance. I should have died in that ditch, he said. By every reasonable calculation, I should have bled out in France, or survived only to lose my leg, or survived intact only to return to Germany and starve in the ruins. But I woke up under a white ceiling, and an American nurse smiled at me, and everything I'd been told about the world was revealed as a lie. Not everything, Margaret said gently. You learned that cruelty was possible. That was true. But you also learned that mercy was possible, and that turned out to be more powerful. Klaus had tried over the years to explain to his children what that ceiling had meant, what it still meant decades later, when he closed his eyes and could still see its perfect whiteness glowing in his memory. His daughter Rebecca, the oldest, had asked him once, she must have been 15, doing a school project on World War II, why he'd chosen to stay in America rather than return home. Because of a ceiling, he'd said, and she'd looked at him with the exasperated confusion of a teenager whose father had once again said something that made no sense. He'd tried to elaborate, told her about the hospital, the medical care, the dentist, the camp in Tennessee. But the words had felt inadequate, had failed to convey the enormity of what he'd experienced. How do you explain to someone who's grown up in abundance what it means to encounter abundance for the first time? How do you describe light to someone who's never known darkness? You don't understand, he'd said finally. You've grown up in a country where hospitals are clean, and medicine is available, and people are treated with dignity, regardless of who they are. You think that's normal, but it's not normal. It's miraculous. It's a choice that a society makes, to value life, to invest in healing, to see humanity, even in the enemy. Rebecca had written her paper and gotten an A, but Klaus had never been sure she'd understood. How could she? She'd been born into the peace he'd helped destroy and then been granted. She'd never known hunger, never known the metallic taste of fear that becomes so constant you stop noticing it, never known what it means to be treated as less than human, and then, suddenly, inexplicably, to be treated as human after all. But now, watching the wall fall, Klaus thought perhaps the younger generation's incomprehension was itself a kind of victory. They couldn't understand because they'd never had to learn. They'd been spared the education he'd received, the education in what humans could do to each other, and what they could do for each other, and how the difference between the two was sometimes as simple as a choice, a policy, a ceiling painted white. In the years after the war, Klaus had tried to calculate what his survival had cost the American taxpayers. It became a kind of obsession, this need to quantify the debt he could never repay. The surgery that saved his leg, hours of a skilled surgeon's time, anesthesia, antibiotics, bandages, a hospital bed for weeks, thousands of dollars certainly, perhaps tens of thousands in modern currency, the dental work, a skilled specialist's time, Novocaine, equipment, follow-up care, hundreds of dollars at minimum. The physical therapy, months of professional care, exercises, attention from trained staff, more thousands. The food at Camp Forest, 2,500 calories daily for 3.5 years. Meat, bread, vegetables, all transported across an ocean and a continent to feed an enemy who'd tried to kill American soldiers. The housing, the guards, the administrative staff processing his immigration paperwork, the bureaucrats who'd decided he was worth saving in a larger sense, worth integrating into American society, rather than simply shipping back to the ruins. The total was astronomical. One German sergeant major transformed from enemy to citizen at a cost that would have funded what? A tank, artillery shells, bombs that could have hastened the war's end and saved American lives. But the Americans had made a different calculation. They decided that even in wartime, even when fighting for survival against an enemy that represented existential evil, there were principles worth maintaining, that wounded prisoners received medical care, that teeth mattered, that futures were possible even for men who'd fought on the wrong side. It was the most American thing Klaus had ever encountered, this insistence that values meant nothing if you abandoned them when they became inconvenient, that civilization was defined not by how you treated your friends, but by how you treated your enemies. In Germany, Klaus had been taught that might made right, that weakness invited destruction, that mercy was a luxury for peacetime. But the Americans had demonstrated something more profound, that mercy wasn't weakness but strength, that a nation secure enough in its power could afford to be generous, that the true measure of civilization wasn't the height of its walls, but the breadth of its compassion. Years later, Klaus had read about the Marshall Plan, the billions of dollars America had poured into rebuilding Europe, including the Germany that had tried to destroy it. He'd read about it and wept, recognizing the same philosophy that had saved his life applied on a continental scale. The Americans had won the war and then, impossibly, had chosen to win the peace by investing in their former enemies' futures. It was madness by any rational calculation. It was also the sanest thing any nation had ever done. In 1994, at age 75, Klaus Richter was invited to speak at a conference on prisoner of war experiences. The organizers had found him through veterans' records, had learned his story, had asked if he'd be willing to share it with an audience of historians, students, and former POWs from various conflicts. He almost declined. He was old, comfortable, content to let the past remain past. But Margaret encouraged him, said that perhaps his testimony mattered, that younger generations needed to hear from people who'd lived through history rather than just read about it. The conference was held in Washington, D.C. in a hotel ballroom filled with perhaps 200 people. Klaus sat on a panel with 3 other former POWs, an American who'd been held by the Japanese, a Korean who'd survived Chinese captivity, a Vietnamese who'd spent years in a re-education camp. Their stories were harrowing, tales of deprivation and torture and survival against impossible odds. When Klaus's turn came, he felt almost apologetic. His story wasn't harrowing. It was the opposite of harrowing. It was a story of unexpected mercy, of principles maintained under pressure, of a ceiling painted white. He spoke for 20 minutes, describing his wounding, his capture, the hospital, the camp, his eventual immigration. He spoke about Dr. Morrison and Captain Wade and Dr. Brennan, about American nurses who'd smiled at him as if his life had value, about the cognitive dissonance of being fed 2,500 calories daily while his countrymen starved. "I was the enemy," he said, his voice steady despite his age. "I had shot at American soldiers. My country had started a war that killed millions. By any reasonable calculation, I deserved nothing but a bullet, or, at best, the minimum care required by the Geneva Convention. Instead, I received medical treatment that was better than what German civilians were getting, better than what German soldiers were getting, better than anything I'd known in 4 years of war." He paused, looking out at the audience. Young faces mostly, students and scholars who'd been born decades after the war ended, who couldn't remember a time when Germany meant jackboots and death camps. "I tell you this not to absolve myself or my country of responsibility for what we did. The Third Reich was evil. The war we started was criminal. The Holocaust was the greatest crime in human history, and every German who participated or failed to resist bears a share of that guilt. I bear that guilt. I will die bearing that guilt. But I also tell you this, the American response to that evil was not more evil. It was its opposite. When they had every right to be cruel, they chose to be kind. When they had every justification for vengeance, they chose mercy. When they could have treated us as we had treated others, with contempt, with brutality, with the logic that says enemy lives have no value, they instead treated us with a humanity that was staggering in its consistency. That white ceiling I woke up under in July 1944, that was American civilization made manifest. Clean, efficient, competent, and fundamentally decent. It was the civilization we'd tried to destroy, and it saved my life anyway, not because I deserved it, but because that's what civilized nations do. They maintain their principles even when, especially when, it would be easier not to. The applause, when it came, was long and genuine. Several audience members had tears in their eyes. A young woman approached him afterward, introduced herself as a history graduate student studying POW treatment in World War II. "Your story is remarkable," she said, "but I have to ask, do you think it was typical? Were all German POWs treated this well?" Klaus considered the question carefully. "I can only speak to my experience and the experiences of the men I knew. But from what I learned, what I saw, what I've read in the years since, yes, American treatment of German POWs was generally consistent with what I experienced. There were exceptions, certainly. War brings out the worst in people sometimes. But the policy, the philosophy, the systematic approach that was to treat prisoners humanely, to follow the Geneva Convention not as a minimum but as a standard. Compare that to how Germany treated Soviet POWs, millions dead from exposure, starvation, execution. Compare it to how Japan treated Allied prisoners, the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, systematic brutality. The Americans could have responded in kind. They chose not to. That choice matters. That choice changed my life. That choice, multiplied by millions of similar choices, helped create the post-war world we live in now. Klaus Richter died in 2003 at the age of 84, surrounded by his family in a Nashville hospital room that was clean and white, and reminded him in his final moments of another room 60 years earlier where his transformation had begun. His obituary, published in the local paper, described him as a beloved husband, father, and grandfather, a skilled electrician who'd helped wire Nashville's post-war expansion, a German immigrant who'd become a proud American citizen. It mentioned, briefly, that he'd served in the German military during World War II and had been captured by American forces, but the details were sparse. The obituary focused on the life he'd built, not the life he'd left behind. But at his funeral, his daughter Rebecca, now herself middle-aged with children of her own, spoke about the ceiling. "My father told me once," she said from the pulpit, her voice steady despite her grief, "that he owed his life to a ceiling. I didn't understand it when I was young. I thought he was being metaphorical or poetic or just old and inclined to say strange things. But as I grew older, as I learned more about the war and what he'd experienced, I began to understand. That ceiling represented everything he'd discovered about America. Its prosperity, yes, but more than that, its values. Its insistence that even in war, even when fighting for survival, certain principles were non-negotiable. That wounded prisoners received medical care. That teeth mattered. That futures were possible even for men who'd made terrible choices or fought for terrible causes. My father was not a hero. He fought for the wrong side in history's greatest conflict between good and evil. He knew that. He carried that knowledge for 60 years, carried it with a humility and shame that never quite faded even as he built a good life here, even as he became a good man. But he was saved, physically, psychologically, spiritually, by people who saw past his uniform to his humanity, by doctors and nurses and dentists who treated him not as an enemy, but as a patient, by a nation that chose mercy over vengeance, that invested in rehabilitation over retribution, that believed people could be more than their worst moments. That ceiling my father woke up under, that perfect, white, clean ceiling, that was the ceiling of possibility, the ceiling that said, you don't have to be what you were. You can choose differently. You can become better. And he did. He became an American. He became a father and grandfather. He became a man who understood, in a way few people ever do, the transformative power of mercy. Rebecca paused, looked out at the gathered mourners, family, friends, fellow immigrants, People who'd known Klaus as the quiet electrician who always did good work and never talked much about the past. My father used to say that America didn't win World War II with bombs and tanks, though of course those mattered. America won by demonstrating that its values were real, that they weren't just propaganda to be abandoned when convenient, that when Americans said all men were created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, they meant it, even for German prisoners of war, even for enemies, even for people who had no claim to kindness except their shared humanity. That's the legacy my father leaves us, not the war he fought, but the peace he found, not the soldier he was, but the man he became, not the ceiling that should have been above him, the ceiling of a grave, or a prison, or the ruins of a defeated nation, but the ceiling that was above him, white, clean, perfect, and impossibly merciful. The American field hospital that Klaus woke up in was dismantled in late 1944, its components packed up and shipped elsewhere as the front moved east. The French manor house that had hosted it survived the war and was eventually converted into a museum dedicated to the Normandy campaign. Camp Forest in Tennessee was closed shortly after the war ended, its barracks torn down, its facilities repurposed or abandoned. The land was eventually returned to farmland and now produces soybeans and corn, where 10,000 German prisoners once lived in unexpected abundance. Dr. Morrison returned to his practice in Boston and worked until he was 70, saving countless lives with the same skill and care he'd shown in that French manor house. He died in 1978, never knowing that one of the German prisoners he'd operated on had gone on to become an American citizen, had built a life in Nashville, had raised children who never knew war. Captain Wade returned to Springfield, Ohio, and continued pulling teeth for 30 years. He never spoke much about the war, never made much of what he'd done, never seemed to recognize that treating enemy prisoners with the same care as his peacetime patients represented anything unusual or heroic. Dr. Brennan went on to a distinguished career in physical medicine and rehabilitation, pioneering treatments for nerve damage and mobility disorders. She published papers, trained residents, built a reputation. In her files, carefully preserved, was a letter from a former German POW thanking her for saving not just his leg, but his future. The white ceiling, that specific ceiling that Klaus saw in July 1944, was eventually painted over, repaired, modernized. But ceilings like it exist in hospitals throughout America still, clean and white and perfect, hovering above patients who may not realize the profound statement those ceilings make, that healing is possible, that care matters, that every person in pain deserves attention regardless of who they are or where they come from or what they've done. Klaus's grandchildren, when they're old enough to understand, are told the story of their grandfather. Not all of it, perhaps, not the full weight of his complicity in history's greatest crime, but enough. Enough to know he fought in a terrible war on the wrong side. Enough to know he was captured and treated with unexpected mercy. Enough to know he chose to become American not just because it was convenient, but because he'd learned something profound about what America could be at its best. They grow up in a world where German soldiers are figures from history books and old movies, where the Third Reich is ancient history, where the idea of total war between great powers seems as remote as medieval sieges. They grow up under white ceilings in houses their grandfather wired, beneficiaries of the peace he helped destroy and then was granted, heirs to a legacy they can barely comprehend. But sometimes in hospitals or dental offices or anywhere with that particular shade of clean white paint, they remember the story their mother told them. They look up at the ceiling and think of a young German sergeant major waking up in 1944, expecting to find hell, and discovering instead a glimpse of something approaching paradise. And they understand, as much as anyone who hasn't lived through war can understand, that mercy is not weakness. That civilization is measured not by its capacity to destroy, but by its capacity to heal. That sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple kindness extended to someone who has no right to expect it. The ceiling endures. White, clean, perfect. A testament to the possibility that even in humanity's darkest hours, even when every incentive points toward cruelty and vengeance and the logic of retribution, people can choose differently. They can choose to heal rather than harm, to save rather than destroy, to see humanity in the enemy and respond not with matching brutality, but with the kind of mercy that transforms not just individuals, but the arc of history itself. Klaus Richter woke up under a white ceiling in July 1944 and forgot the war. Not literally, never literally, because you don't forget the war when you've lived through it, when you've participated in it, when you've worn its uniform and fired its weapons. But he forgot the propaganda. He forgot the lies about who his enemies were. He forgot the comfortable fictions that had made atrocity possible. And in forgetting those things, in having them stripped away by the simple fact of American mercy, rendered with systematic competence, he remembered something more fundamental. He remembered what it meant to be human. He remembered that suffering matters, that life has value, that the species to which we all belong transcends the uniforms we wear or the flags we salute. That memory, painful, transformative, impossible to ignore, became the foundation of everything that followed. The new life, the new citizenship, the new identity as an American who understood in his bones what America meant when it lived up to its ideals. It all began with a ceiling, white, clean, perfect, and improbably merciful. The war ended. The ceiling endured. And Klaus Richter, former Sergeant Major of the Third Reich, became an American, saved not by bombs or treaties or the natural passage of time, but by the radical revolutionary act of being treated when he least deserved it as if his life mattered. Because it did. Because all lives do. Because that's what the ceiling meant and means and will always mean.